My name is Ella Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as a wife first, a financial analyst second, and everything else somewhere far behind those two roles. Most people who meet me for the first time use the same words: composed, agreeable, easy to talk to. I've always had a quiet voice. I listen more than I speak. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention in a room. In meetings, I'm the one taking notes while someone else presents the conclusions I calculated. At family gatherings, I refill glasses and remember birthdays while louder personalities dominate the table. What people rarely notice is that quiet does not mean unaware. For most of my marriage, I let others assume I was soft, harmless, the supportive wife behind a confident man. My husband, Daniel, liked to joke that I was low maintenance and not the type to make a fuss. He meant it as a compliment. So did his friends. When he asked me to sign a prenuptial agreement 3 months before our wedding, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse him of mistrust. I read it, line by line. That was the beginning. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about dramatic courtroom scenes or public humiliation. There were no screaming matches, no shattered plates, no viral social media posts. It's about something quieter than that. It's about what happens when someone mistakes your calm for compliance, when they believe love makes you blind, when they assume you won't look closely at what they're asking you to give up. My husband demanded a prenup. I gave him a lawsuit instead, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because he underestimated who he married. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how a single document changed the way I saw my marriage, how silence became a strategy, and how the man who thought he was protecting himself learned the hard way not to underestimate me. I won't exaggerate, I won't villainize. I'll tell you exactly what happened and why I made the choices I did. Because sometimes the loudest justice isn't loud at all. Have you ever been mistaken for weaker than you actually are, simply because you chose not to argue? Before the prenup, before the lawsuit, before any of it, I was Daniel's wife. That's how people introduced me at networking events. This is Ella. She works with numbers, but honestly, she keeps Daniel organized. They would laugh. I would smile. Daniel was charismatic in the way some men learn to be early in life. He filled the silence effortlessly. He shook hands firmly, remembered names, and told stories that made people lean in. He owned a growing tech consultancy firm, and in social settings, he sparkled. Next to him, I seemed muted. It wasn't that I lacked accomplishments. By 36, I had built a reputation at my firm for identifying financial inconsistencies others missed. I specialized in risk assessment and compliance audits. Quiet work, precise work, the kind that prevents disasters no one ever knows almost happened. But prevention isn't flashy. At dinner parties, when someone asked what I did, Daniel would answer for me. She makes sure people like me don't get into trouble. It was meant as praise. Over time, I noticed how often my role was translated into something supportive rather than strategic. Even my in-laws described me as steady, the kind of woman who would always hold things together. Reliable, stable, safe, invisible. And I let that perception exist. Part of it came from habit. Growing up, I was the middle child between two siblings who excelled loudly, one in sports, the other in debate. I learned early that if I wanted peace, I needed to observe before speaking. If I wanted to be heard, I needed evidence. So I built myself on competence, not volume. Daniel liked that about me. He once told me I was refreshingly undramatic. He had dated women who challenged him publicly, who questioned him in front of others. With me, he felt admired. But admiration is a fragile thing when it's built on an assumption. In our marriage, I managed our household finances, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. He preferred growth, expansion, big moves. I preferred the structure. I tracked investments, reviewed insurance policies, compared tax strategies. I knew exactly where every dollar moved. He didn't ask. He trusted me with the operational details of our life while he focused on building his company. And because I rarely objected to his decisions publicly, he interpreted my silence as agreement. I wasn't unhappy. That's important. There were no dramatic red flags, no cruelty, no explosive fights. We traveled, we hosted dinners, we posted smiling photos like everyone else. But under the surface, there was a subtle pattern. When financial discussions became complex, Daniel's tone would shift slightly, not dismissive, just certain. I've got this. Even when the topic overlapped with my expertise, I would offer a suggestion. He would nod politely. Then he would proceed as he'd planned, and I would let him, not because I doubted myself, but because I believed partnership meant choosing your battles. What I didn't see, what I didn't want to see, was that over time, those small concessions created a narrative about who I was in our marriage, the calm one, the supportive one, the one who would never push back hard enough to change the direction of the room. When Daniel asked for a prenup, he wasn't trying to hurt me. He was acting on that narrative. He believed I would sign. He believed I wouldn't read it too closely. He believed love would outweigh leverage. And at that point in my life, I almost believed it too. He smiled, relieved, almost grateful. See, this is why I love you, no drama. There it was, the first small cut. It wasn't the prenup itself. I understand them. I work with contracts every day. I believe in protecting assets. It was the assumption behind it. He hadn't asked how I felt about the idea. He hadn't discussed whether we should create one together. He hadn't said, let's sit down with both our lawyers and build something fair. He had already drafted it, without me, and he was confident I would accept it because I was not dramatic. Later that night, I opened the document in our study. Daniel had gone to bed early. He trusted me to review it alone. Line by line, I read. The agreement heavily protected his business interests, which made sense. But it also categorized nearly all future growth of joint assets as separate if they were connected in any indirect way to his company. Even the appreciation of property purchased after marriage could fall under certain clauses if company funds were involved. It was thorough, strategic, unbalanced. The document assumed that my financial contributions, my salary, my investments, my management of shared funds would be secondary in value. It framed the future as though his growth would drive everything, and mine would simply orbit around it. I didn't feel angry. I felt studious, as if someone had quietly measured how much I was likely to tolerate. The next morning at breakfast, I asked lightly, "Did your lawyer ask about my assets?" Daniel shrugged. "Not really necessary. Yours aren't tied to the company." I stirred my coffee slowly. "But they're tied to me." He laughed softly, misreading my tone. "Ella, it's just paperwork. You're not the kind of person who would ever try to take advantage." Another small cut. Not the words themselves, but the implication that fairness would only matter if I were the type to exploit him. He believed protection was logical for him and unnecessary for me. That was the moment I understood something subtle and important. He trusted my character. He did not respect my leverage. And that difference would change everything. After that first conversation, something quiet settled between us. Not tension, not hostility, just awareness. Daniel emailed me the finalized draft 2 days later. His lawyer had polished a few clauses. The language was tighter now, cleaner, harder to challenge emotionally. I didn't respond immediately. At work, I requested a personal day for the following Friday, no explanation. I rarely took time off unless necessary, and my supervisor approved it without question. I spent that Friday at a cafe near the courthouse downtown, my laptop open, highlighter in hand. I wasn't reading it as a fiancé. I was reading it as an analyst. Patterns reveal themselves when you step back from sentiment, and the pattern was clear. The agreement framed risk as something I posed to him, not something marriage creates mutually. It protected his business from me. It protected inherited assets from me. It even limited claims on joint property appreciation under certain conditions. But it didn't include reciprocal safeguards. There were no mirrored clauses ensuring transparency of corporate earnings, no protections in case of concealed distributions, no acknowledgement of non-financial contributions. It assumed I would never need protection. Because I was steady. That weekend, Daniel hosted drinks for 2 colleagues at our apartment. I listened from the kitchen while finishing appetizers. One of them asked about wedding planning. "Ella's handling most of it," Daniel said. "She's great with details. I focus on scaling the company. We each play to our strengths." It sounded fair. Balanced, except I realized something uncomfortable. My strengths were always described as supportive infrastructure. He was described as an expansion. Even when the conversation drifted to investments, he summarized my professional work as risk cleanup. He never lied about me. He just reduced me, and I let him. That was the part I had to confront honestly. No one forced me into silence. I chose it. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting minor phrasing. I told myself healthy marriages don't require constant scorekeeping. But small dismissals compound. A week later, I suggested we consult a second attorney together, just to ensure the agreement reflected both perspectives. Daniel frowned slightly. Do we need to complicate this? My lawyer's one of the best in the city. I'm sure he is, I said calmly, but he represents you. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Ella, you know I'd never screw you over. I did know that. At least I believed it. But trust and structure are not the same thing. He wasn't intentionally trying to disadvantage me. He simply couldn't imagine a future where I would assert equal negotiating power, because I never had. That realization didn't ignite anger. It created clarity. Over the next few days, I paid attention to smaller moments I had previously dismissed. How often did he make financial decisions before discussing them? How naturally he assumed I would adapt. How frequently my expertise was treated as advisory rather than authoritative. It wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning, and I had participated in it. The prenup wasn't the first imbalance. It was just the first one formalized on paper. I stopped arguing internally about whether I was being too sensitive. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If this document defines the rules of our future, who does he believe holds the power? And more importantly, why have I allowed that belief to stand unchallenged? The more I observed, the clearer it became. I had been assigned a role long before the prenup ever appeared. Not maliciously, not explicitly, but consistently. I was the stabilizer, the one who made life efficient, who handled logistics, who remembered renewal dates, scheduled maintenance, reconciled accounts, compared insurance premiums, and negotiated better mortgage terms. Daniel liked to say I was the backbone. It sounded strong, but backbones aren't visible. They support. They don't lead. A week after the prenup draft, we attended dinner at his parents' house. His mother poured wine and smiled warmly at me. I always knew Daniel needed someone grounded, she said. He's a dreamer. You're the practical one. I smiled back. Compliments wrapped in quiet limitations. Dreamers build empires. Practical women make sure the bills are paid. During dessert, Daniel and his father discussed potential investors. I listened, noting inconsistencies in projected valuation estimates. I knew the numbers didn't align with the last quarterly report Daniel had shown me. When there was a pause, I gently offered a correction. His father blinked. Daniel chuckled lightly. Ella's always triple-checking me. The room laughed. It wasn't humiliating, it wasn't hostile, but the correction wasn't addressed. It was dismissed as personality. Later that night, driving home, I asked calmly, "Did you review the latest projections before discussing valuation?" Daniel sighed. "I have it handled. You don't need to audit me." That word lingered. Audit. As if my expertise were intrusive rather than collaborative. That was the moment I understood the role clearly. Reliable, useful, quiet, but never central to power. The prenup made sense within that framework. If I were infrastructure, then the empire needed protection from me. If I were supportive, then structural safeguards in my favor would be unnecessary. It wasn't that Daniel didn't love me. He simply loved a version of me that didn't disrupt his authority, and I had reinforced that version for years. I rarely corrected him in public. I avoided challenging him in front of others. I believed discretion was respect, but discretion can slowly become erasure. One evening, as I reorganized files in our home office, I found older drafts of Daniel's early business plans. I had edited those too. Late nights, quiet revisions, tightening financial projections before he ever pitched investors. My fingerprints were all over the foundation. Yet none of that was acknowledged in the prenup. The agreement treated our marriage like a merger between unequal entities. His corporation and my loyalty. That realization didn't hurt the way you might expect. It clarified something deeper. I wasn't angry at Daniel. I was disappointed in myself because I had allowed my competence to remain backstage. I had mistaken invisibility for harmony, and now that invisibility was being codified into law. That night, sitting alone in the living room, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I disappeared tomorrow, financially, strategically, structurally, how long would it take for him to realize how much of his independence had quietly depended on me? And for the first time, I didn't want to test that answer emotionally. I wanted to test it practically. Something in me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen while reading the prenup. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon at my office under fluorescent lights while reviewing a compliance case that had nothing to do with my marriage. A client had underestimated a junior partner for years. Quiet man, detail-oriented, never confrontational. The firm's leadership believed he was loyal and unambitious until they discovered he had been documenting inconsistencies in executive compensation for over 18 months. Not maliciously, not impulsively, methodically. When the discrepancies surfaced, the board didn't question his credibility. They questioned why no one had noticed his leverage sooner. I stared at that file longer than necessary. There's a particular kind of power in documentation, in patience, in understanding systems better than the people who believe they run them. And suddenly, my situation stopped feeling emotional. It started feeling structural. That evening, Daniel mentioned that his lawyer had followed up. "Did you get a chance to look at it again?" he asked casually while loosening his tie. "I did," I said evenly. "And?" "I have some notes." He smiled, expecting minor edits. "Of course you do." There was no malice in his tone, just certainty. He believed my notes would be cosmetic. That night, after he went to sleep, I opened my laptop at the dining table. I created a new folder, not labeled Prenup. Not labeled Daniel, I labeled it Documentation. I began organizing. Our joint accounts, business transfers I had previously reviewed casually, investment movements, property titles, email threads regarding financial decisions. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just clarity. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I was mapping influence. For years, I had managed the financial architecture of our home quietly. I knew how funds flowed between his company and our personal accounts. I knew when bonuses were issued, when distributions were deferred, and when expenses were reclassified. I had never considered that knowledge leverage. I considered it a partnership. But partnerships require symmetry. If he wanted legal insulation, then I needed visibility. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney recommended by a colleague, someone specializing in marital contracts and business asset intersections. I didn't tell Daniel yet, not because I was hiding something, but because I realized something important. Silence is not the same as submission. Sometimes it is preparation. When I met the attorney 3 days later, I brought my navy leather portfolio. Inside were neatly tabbed sections. Summaries, timelines, asset lists, asset. She reviewed the prenup draft slowly. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "This agreement protects him extensively," she said calmly. "It does not protect you proportionally." I nodded. I already knew that. "What would you like to do?" she asked. That was the first time anyone had framed the situation as my choice. Not my reaction, my choice. And in that moment, something settled inside me. For years, I had optimized stability. Now I would optimize fairness. No confrontation, no emotional outbursts, no ultimatums. Just structure. Daniel believed I would sign because I valued peace. He wasn't wrong. I do value peace, but not at the cost of erasing myself. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was the realization that I didn't need to argue to alter the outcome. I just needed to understand the system better than he assumed I did. And I did. After meeting with my attorney, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't accuse him of imbalance. I didn't even mention the consultation. Instead, I did something that confused him more than resistance ever would have. I became quieter, not distant, not cold, just observant. When he brought up the prenup again the following week, I nodded thoughtfully. "I'm still reviewing it," I said. "I want to understand every clause." He smiled, satisfied. "That's why you're good with numbers." He still thought this was an academic exercise. Over the next few weeks, I stopped volunteering financial advice about his company unless he directly asked. I continued managing our household accounts flawlessly, bills paid, investments adjusted, taxes optimized. But I stopped filling in the gaps he left. When he made assumptions about projected income, I didn't correct them immediately. When he estimated timelines for expansion, I didn't refine them. I let him operate without my invisible stabilizers. He didn't notice at first. People rarely notice the absence of quiet labor until friction appears. One evening, he came home frustrated. "Cash flow's tighter than I expected this quarter," he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. "It'll balance out." In the past, I would have already prepared a contingency scenario. That night, I simply asked, "Do you want to walk through it together?" He hesitated. "I've got it." I nodded. Silence, when chosen intentionally, feels different. It's not avoidance, it's positioning. At my attorney's suggestion, I requested full financial disclosures related to his business, framed as due diligence for the prenup. Daniel complied without suspicion. After all, transparency made him look reasonable. He didn't question why I requested historical distribution records going back 3 years. He didn't question why I asked about deferred compensation structures. He assumed I was being thorough with paperwork. He didn't realize I was mapping patterns. The more I reviewed, the clearer it became that while nothing illegal had occurred, asset classifications were flexible. Income could be timed. Valuations could be framed optimistically or conservatively depending on context. Legal, strategic, advantageous. My attorney reviewed everything with clinical calm. "You have more influence here than he realizes," she said, "especially if you can demonstrate material contribution to growth during the marriage." Material contribution. Such a clinical phrase for years of late-night financial modeling and risk mitigation. I began compiling timelines. Edits I made to early investor decks. Cash flow projections I refined. Tax strategies I implemented that increased retained earnings. Not as ammunition, as evidence. Daniel interpreted my continued calm as agreement. At dinner with friends, he mentioned the prenup casually. "It's just smart," he said. "Ella understands that." I met his eyes across the table and smiled softly. "I understand structure," I replied. He didn't hear the distinction. Silence is powerful when the other person fills it with their own assumptions. Daniel believed my lack of confrontation meant alignment. In reality, it meant assessment. I wasn't planning revenge. I was evaluating equilibrium. If the agreement could be renegotiated fairly, I would sign it. If not, I would choose a different path. But either way, I would not enter marriage legally diminished. The quietest shifts are often the most permanent, and by then I had already shifted. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. In the weeks leading up to our wedding, our lives appeared perfectly normal. Invitations were mailed. Final fittings were scheduled. My mother called daily with minor details about floral arrangements. Daniel was busy closing a new client contract, one that, if successful, would significantly increase his company's valuation. He was energized. I was methodical. Every evening after dinner, I spent an hour at the dining table with my laptop open. Daniel assumed I was reviewing wedding invoices or work emails. Sometimes I was. Most nights, I was building a timeline. I documented every measurable financial contribution I had made since we moved in together. Not emotionally, not rhetorically, quantitatively. The mortgage refinancing I initiated reduced our interest rate by 1.2%. The tax restructuring saved his company 6 figures over 2 fiscal years. The risk exposure I flagged before he signed an early vendor contract, preventing potential litigation. I attached emails, drafts with track changes, date stamps, not to prove I was supportive. To demonstrate material impact, my attorney guided me carefully. "If you sign this prenup as written," she said during one meeting, "you're formalizing a narrative where your intellectual labor holds no long-term equity." Equity. That word settled heavily. Daniel often spoke about equity when discussing investors, but never when discussing me. The more I reviewed financial disclosures, the more I noticed something subtle. In the last 18 months, several distributions had been deferred strategically, retained within the company to strengthen valuation before seeking additional funding. Smart move. But it meant that on paper, his personal income appeared lower than his actual growth trajectory. If we married under the current prenup structure, and if those distributions were released post-marriage, they could potentially remain classified as separate. Legal. Calculated. Unquestioned, unless someone understood timing. I didn't accuse him of hiding assets. He likely saw it as standard business strategy. But strategy cuts both ways. At work, I requested access to archive compliance training modules related to marital asset classification. No one questioned it. Continuous learning was encouraged. On weekends, while Daniel met with investors, I met with my attorney. We ran scenarios. If the prenup were signed unchanged, if minor revisions were negotiated, if I declined to sign, if I postponed the wedding. Each option had consequences: financial, social, emotional. I considered them all without panic. That's what they never noticed. I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. One afternoon, Daniel came home unusually irritated. An investor pushed back on valuation assumptions, he said. People get nervous when they don't understand growth cycles. I looked up from my laptop. Did you show them the deferred distribution projections? He hesitated. I don't want to overcomplicate the deck. There it was again. The same instinct that shaped the prenup. Control the narrative. Simplify perception. Assume I wouldn't challenge framing. I closed my laptop gently. Clarity isn't complication, I said softly. He shrugged. You worry too much about technicalities. Maybe I did. But technicalities are what contracts are built on. 2 weeks before the wedding, my attorney finished drafting a response to the prenup. It wasn't aggressive. It was symmetrical. Reciprocal protections. Transparent disclosure requirements. Equitable classification of appreciation tied to joint strategic contributions. Balanced. I read it 3 times. Then I placed it neatly inside my Navy portfolio. Daniel still believed the conversation would end with my signature. He had no idea I was about to change the terms entirely. Not through emotion, through structure. And if he refused, I had already calculated that possibility too. The leverage didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It emerged slowly, from patterns. 3 weeks before the wedding, my attorney requested one final set of disclosures: updated corporate bylaws and the most recent shareholder agreements. Daniel forwarded them without hesitation. See, he said lightly when sending the email, full transparency. I thanked him, and then I read. Buried in an amendment from the previous year was a clause regarding spousal consent in the event of equity transfers. Standard language, but with an important nuance. If any equity issued during the marriage was later disputed or restructured, spousal acknowledgement could become legally relevant depending on classification. Most people would skim past it. I didn't. Combined with the deferred distribution timing and the way the prenup defined separate property growth, a narrow but significant window appeared. If I signed the prenup unchanged, I would waive claims to certain post-marital appreciation linked to pre-marital assets, even if my strategic input demonstrably increased valuation. But if the agreement were proven materially unbalanced, particularly if disclosure timing influenced classification, enforceability could be challenged later. Not guaranteed, but arguable. I sat with that information quietly. Leverage is not about aggression. It's about understanding pressure points before you ever apply them. I met my attorney the following afternoon. If he refuses to revise, I asked. She folded her hands calmly. Then you decide whether you want to enter a marriage that begins with asymmetry, or you preserve your position now. Preserve your position. That phrase felt grounding. This wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. That evening, Daniel was reviewing seating charts when I sat across from him. I'd like us both to meet with our attorneys together, I said gently. He exhaled slowly. Ella, this is getting heavier than it needs to be. It's a contract, I replied. Contracts are supposed to be thorough. He rubbed his forehead. Why does this suddenly feel adversarial? It wasn't sudden. It was just visible now. I'm not your adversary, I said evenly, but I won't be structurally disadvantaged either. He stared at me, not angry, just unsettled. It was the first time I had spoken about fairness in explicit terms. That night, after he went to bed early, I opened my laptop again, and that's when I saw it. An internal memo from his CFO, forwarded months ago, something I had skimmed but not fully examined. It outlined a strategic timeline for distributing retained earnings after anticipated valuation increases. The target date? 2 months after our wedding. Legally logical, financially smart, but in the context of the prenup's current wording, potentially transformative. If those distributions were technically linked to premarital growth yet realized post-marriage, classification would matter enormously. My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. I simply felt clear. He hadn't hidden it maliciously, but he hadn't explained it either. He assumed I wouldn't connect the dots. That was the moment the emotional question disappeared. This was no longer about trust alone. It was about informed consent. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. I had two options: negotiate aggressively and risk postponing the wedding, or sign quietly and retain the ability to challenge later if a material disclosure imbalance could be demonstrated. Neither option involved shouting, neither involved revenge. But one involved irreversible leverage. I chose the one he would never expect. Not confrontation, not compliance, documentation. If necessary, litigation. Not to take more than my share, but to prevent being written out of value I helped create. I slid the printed memo into my portfolio beside the revised prenup draft, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to certainty. He believed the document protected him. He had no idea it might one day protect me instead. There's a moment before any irreversible choice where the world becomes very quiet, not externally, internally. For me, that moment came 10 days before the wedding. The venue coordinator was confirming final guest counts. My mother was debating between two nearly identical shades of ivory for the table linens. Daniel was finalizing a contract with the investor who had questioned his projections weeks earlier. Life was moving forward confidently, and I was standing at a crossroads no one else could see. My attorney had laid out the paths clearly. Option 1. Refuse to sign unless the prenup is revised symmetrically. Risk of postponing the wedding. Risk public explanation. Risk Daniel perceiving me as adversarial. Option 2. Postpone the wedding under a neutral pretext. Buy time. Continue negotiations privately. Option 3. Sign the prenup as written, but do so after formally requesting clarifications and disclosures that document the imbalance. Preserve the right to challenge enforceability later if material misrepresentation or inequity became provable. The third option was the most strategic and the most irreversible, because it meant entering the marriage knowing I might one day litigate. Not impulsively, not angrily, but if necessary. I asked myself a difficult question. Did I want to marry a man I might one day sue? The answer wasn't simple. I loved Daniel. That part remained true. But love without structural respect is fragile. If I refused to sign, he would feel blindsided. He would interpret it as mistrust, perhaps even betrayal. If I signed quietly without preparation, I would betray myself. I went for a walk alone along the Charles River that evening. The air was cool, early autumn just beginning to touch the trees. I watched runners pass, couples walking dogs, and a child learning to ride a bike. Marriage is a contract layered over emotion. We romanticize the emotion and ignore the contract. Daniel believed asking for a prenup was responsible. I believed signing one blindly was negligent. As I walked, I realized something steady and uncomfortable. The lawsuit was not revenge. It was a contingency. If the agreement was truly fair, it would withstand scrutiny. If it wasn't, the law existed for a reason. I returned home and found Daniel reviewing spreadsheets at the dining table. He looked up. "You okay? You've been quiet lately." "I've been thinking," I said. "That's never a bad thing," he smiled. I sat across from him and opened my portfolio. "I'm willing to sign," I said calmly, "but I want written confirmation of full financial disclosure as of this date." He blinked. "Of course, that's standard. And I want the acknowledgement that strategic distributions currently retained in the company are reflected accurately in valuation projections." His expression shifted slightly. Subtle, but noticeable. "That's detailed." "I'm detailed." Silence stretched between us. He studied me differently then, not as the agreeable partner, as an equal. "Are you planning something I should know about?" he asked, half joking. I held his gaze. "I'm planning to protect myself the same way you are." He leaned back slowly. For the first time, he understood this wasn't passive compliance. It was deliberate positioning. He nodded after a moment. "Fine, we'll document everything." And just like that, the path was chosen. I would sign. With records, with timelines, with disclosures formalized. And if the structure ever proved inequitable, I would not argue emotionally. I would file. He believed the prenup ended the conversation. He didn't yet realize it was simply defining the battlefield. The week we signed the prenup felt almost ceremonial. Not romantic, procedural. We sat in a polished conference room at his lawyer's office. Large windows, neutral art on the walls. Bottled water was placed neatly in front of us. Daniel looked relaxed, confident. I looked composed. Both attorneys reviewed the final draft aloud, clause by clause. The additional disclosures I requested were attached as exhibits, signed, dated, and acknowledged. Full financial statements as of that month. Documentation of deferred distributions. Written confirmation of corporate valuation methodology. Everything clean, everything proper. When it was my turn to sign, I didn't hesitate. I placed my signature carefully on each marked line. The pen didn't shake because I wasn't surrendering. I was documenting. Afterward, Daniel squeezed my hand in the hallway. "See," he said lightly, "we're just being smart." "Yes," I replied, "we are." The wedding went forward beautifully. It was elegant, warm, and intimate. Friends toasted our future. Our families cried. Daniel looked at me like he had chosen wisely. And in many ways, he had. I didn't marry him to win. I married him with clarity. The first few months of marriage were peaceful, predictable. We moved through routines easily. His company continued growing. The investor deal closed successfully. Public announcements followed. Valuation increased exactly as projected. 2 months later, the deferred distributions were released. Significant, life-changing for most people, strategic for Daniel, predictable for me. I didn't react visibly, but I updated my documentation file that night. Dates, amounts, board resolutions. Nothing dramatic, just records. Over the following year, subtle shifts emerged. Daniel became more absorbed in expansion. Travel increased, decision-making accelerated. I continued managing our personal financial architecture, but now with boundaries. I no longer correct projections unless asked. I no longer optimized tax strategies preemptively. When he made business moves that blurred the lines between personal and corporate funds, I flagged them in writing, gently, professionally, always documented. At my attorney's recommendation, I also kept records of my strategic contributions post-marriage, meeting notes, advisory emails, and modeling drafts he requested before investor presentations. He still valued my input, but he never recalibrated ownership. In his mind, growth belonged to him. Support belonged to me. Until the second year of our marriage, when something shifted financially. A restructuring plan was proposed to consolidate equity classes before a potential acquisition discussion. And in that restructuring draft, spousal acknowledgement appeared again. Routine language, standard procedure, but now it intersected with documented distributions and valuation timing tied to the prenup's asymmetrical clauses. My attorney reviewed it quietly. "This is the window," she said, not aggressively, not urgently, just factually. "If you believe material contribution and disclosure timing created inequity, this is where you act." I didn't file that day. I waited. I watched. And then Daniel made one final decision without consulting me. Reclassifying a portion of retained earnings retroactively for tax optimization. Legal, but it shifted classification narratives tied to marital growth. He mentioned it casually at dinner. "It's cleaner this way," he said. Cleaner. That word settled heavily. Clean for whom? That night, I opened my laptop, not in anger, not in heartbreak, in precision. I emailed my attorney one sentence: "Proceed." And just like that, the silence ended. Not with shouting, with paperwork. The first sign wasn't anger. It was confusion. Daniel received the notice on a Thursday morning. I know because he called me at 10:17 a.m., his voice lower than usual. "Ella, did your attorney file something?" I was at my desk, reviewing quarterly compliance summaries. "Yes," I said calmly. I authorized it. Silence. Not explosive, just stunned. "It's challenging the prenup?" he asked slowly. "It's challenging to enforceability under material imbalance and disclosure timing." He exhaled sharply. "Ella, what is this?" "This." As if it were a foreign object dropped into our lives. "It's a review," I replied. "That's what courts are for." The notice wasn't theatrical. It didn't accuse him of fraud. It didn't allege misconduct. It argued structural inequity based on documented contributions and financial timing that materially impacted classification under the prenup. Technical, precise, supported by exhibits. For the rest of that day, he didn't respond to my messages. That evening, he came home early. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He looked disoriented. "I don't understand," he said quietly in the living room. "You signed it." "I did," I agreed. "You agreed to it." "I agreed to the document as written and disclosed." His jaw tightened slightly. "So this was your plan from the beginning?" "No," I said evenly. "It was my contingency." He stared at me like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't cataloged before. The legal process moved slowly but decisively. His legal team responded confidently at first, arguing clarity of language, voluntary execution, and mutual consent. My attorney responded with timelines, exhibits, documented advisory contributions, deferred distribution schedules, internal memos, nothing emotional, nothing personal, just structure. That's when the consequences began to ripple outward. The potential acquisition discussions paused. Investors requested clarification on pending litigation. Standard due diligence when corporate leadership is involved in financial disputes, even personal ones. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Daniel began spending longer hours at the office. His tone shifted from disbelief to urgency. "We can settle this quietly," he suggested one evening. "Why escalate?" "I didn't escalate," I said. I filled. He paced slowly. "You could have talked to me." "I did," I replied gently, "before we signed." He had heard me then, but he hadn't recalibrated. Now recalibration was happening externally. His parents called, concerned but cautious. They didn't accuse me. They simply asked if everything was okay. "It's a legal clarification," I told them. "Nothing more." Publicly, nothing appeared dramatic. Privately, pressure accumulated. Daniel wasn't angry in the way people expect. He was unsettled, because for the first time, he couldn't rely on narrative control. This wasn't about character. It was about documentation. One night, as he reviewed yet another email from his attorneys, he looked at me across the kitchen. "You really thought I'd disadvantage you?" I held his gaze. "I thought the structure did." And that distinction changed everything. The consequences weren't explosive. They were cumulative. Investor hesitation, legal fees, strategic delays. Not ruin, just reality. For the first time in our relationship, my silence wasn't cushioning the impact. It was defining it. By the third month of litigation, the tone had shifted completely. Not publicly. The case was still procedural, technical, almost boring to anyone outside corporate law. But inside our home, something fundamental had changed. Daniel was no longer confused. He was anxious. Not about losing everything. That was never on the table. The case wasn't designed to strip him of his company or humiliate him. It was about reclassification, about equitable recognition of marital contribution, about enforceability standards. But anxiety doesn't measure scale. It measures uncertainty. One evening, he sat across from me at the dining table, the same table where we had once planned seating charts. "I didn't realize it would affect the acquisition talks," he said quietly. "They paused, not canceled," I replied. That pause cost leverage. There it was again. Leverage. A word he had always associated with investors. Now it applies to me. "I would have renegotiated," he continued, "if you'd just told me you felt this strongly." I folded my hands calmly. "I did tell you before we signed." He ran a hand through his hair. "I thought we were protecting ourselves." "We were," I said, "just not equally." Silence stretched between us. Heavier now, not hostile, just resigned. His attorneys had begun advising settlement discussions, not because they believed the prenup would automatically fail, but because litigation introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability unsettles investors. One afternoon, he forwarded me an email accidentally, likely meant for his legal team. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't insulting. It was worse. "We underestimated the depth of her documentation." Underestimated. That word landed softly. He hadn't underestimated my intelligence. He had underestimated my threshold. There's a difference. Over the following weeks, he shifted from defensiveness to negotiation. "We can revise the agreement retroactively," he suggested one night. "Rebalance things, withdraw the case." I listened, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine accepting. Closing the file, restoring calm, preserving the version of us that existed before paperwork became personal. But something irreversible had already occurred. The lawsuit wasn't just about assets anymore. It was about precedent. If I withdrew now without structural correction formalized under court supervision, the imbalance would remain narrative, not legal. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said quietly. I know, he replied, and for the first time he sounded certain of that. I'm trying to correct something that shouldn't have required litigation in the first place. He looked tired, not defeated, just humbled. The investors eventually resumed discussions, cautiously. Legal review clauses expanded, due diligence deepened. Nothing collapsed, but nothing felt untouchable anymore either. At home, we moved around each other carefully, not cold, just aware. And one evening, standing in the kitchen where the prenup conversation first began, Daniel said something I hadn't expected. I didn't think you would ever force the issue. Force. I shook my head gently. I didn't force it, I said. I felt it. By then, it was too late to undo the revelation. He knew now. I was not infrastructure. I was leveraging. And once someone sees that clearly, the dynamic never returns to its previous shape. The real confrontation didn't happen in court. It happened at our dining table. No raised voices, no accusations, no shattered glass. Just two people finally speaking without assumptions. It was late. The city outside our windows hummed softly. Daniel had just returned from a meeting with his legal team. I had finished reviewing the latest settlement proposal. He sat down across from me, slower than usual. They're recommending we settle, he said. I assume they would. He nodded faintly. They believe the court could go either way, and uncertainty is expensive. Yes, I agreed. It is. He studied me carefully. Is this about money? He asked. It wasn't defensive. It was genuine. No, I said calmly. It's about structure. He leaned back, absorbing that. For years, I continued, I supported your growth without needing recognition. I didn't keep score. I didn't demand titles. But when the prenup defined value, it excluded what I contributed. He didn't interrupt. That exclusion may not have been malicious, I said, but it was measurable. Daniel exhaled slowly. I never thought of you as separate from me. That's the problem, I replied gently. You thought of the company as separate from us. The words hung between us, precise, not sharp. He looked down at his hands. I thought I was being responsible, he said, protecting what I built. And I thought I was protecting what we built, I answered. Silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. He finally looked up. You documented everything, he said quietly. I didn't even realize how much you'd done. I didn't document it to surprise you, I said. I documented it because it existed. He gave a small, almost humorless smile. I used to call you low maintenance. I remember. That was arrogance, he admitted, not admiration. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was simple, honest. The settlement proposal on the table included revised asset classification, acknowledgement of material contribution, and structured equity recognition moving forward. Balanced, not excessive, fair. If we agree to this, he said slowly, the case ends. Yes, and we move forward? If we both understand what forward actually means. He nodded. For the first time since the lawsuit began, we weren't negotiating from positions of assumption. We were negotiating from clarity. He reached across the table, not urgently, not desperately, just steadily. I did underestimate you, he said. I know. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, just confirmation. And in that moment, I realized something important. The lawsuit had never been about winning. It had been about being seen accurately, not as supportive a background, not as quiet loyalty, but as an equal force. And sometimes, the calmest confrontations are the ones that change everything. The settlement was finalized without spectacle. No dramatic court appearances, no public statements, no social media whispers. Just revised documents, restructured classifications, and signatures that carried a different weight than the ones I placed on the prenup years earlier. This time, the language reflected symmetry. Acknowledgement of material contribution. Transparent reporting requirements. Equitable treatment of post-marital growth is tied to shared strategic input. Nothing extravagant, just accurate. Daniel and I didn't celebrate when it was done. We sat in the quiet of our living room, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just legally, but relationally. For the first time in our marriage, he asked for my perspective before making a financial decision. Not performatively, not cautiously, naturally. The change wasn't immediate warmth or dramatic reconciliation. It was recalibration. He began inviting me into early-stage discussions about business restructuring. not after drafts were complete, but before assumptions solidified. He stopped introducing me as the one who keeps me out of trouble. He started saying, "She helped build the financial architecture." Small phrasing changes, significant impact. And as for me, I stopped shrinking to preserve comfort. I stopped translating my expertise into softer language to avoid intimidation. I didn't become louder. I became direct. There's a difference. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about refusing to disappear. The lawsuit did not make me bitter. It made me precise. I no longer confuse harmony with self-erasure. I no longer assume love will automatically create fairness. And I no longer allow structural imbalance to hide behind good intentions. Daniel once asked me, months after everything settled, "Would you have left if I refused to correct it?" I answered honestly, yes. Not because I wanted to, but because I now understand something I didn't before. Respect that requires silence isn't respect. It's convenient. Our marriage today looks steadier, not because conflict vanished, but because assumptions did. He knows I will document. He knows I will file if necessary, not out of spite, out of principle. And strangely, that knowledge created more trust than blind agreement ever did. I am still calm, still composed, still observant, but I am no longer underestimated. Not by him, and most importantly, not by myself. When people hear the title of my story, "My husband demanded a prenup, I gave him a lawsuit instead," they expect fury. They expect revenge. They expect humiliation. They expect a woman scorned. That's not what this was. He learned the hard way not to underestimate me. But I also learned something just as important. Quiet does not mean compliant. Patience does not mean powerless. Love does not mean unprotected. For years, I believed being low conflict was a virtue in itself. I believed that choosing not to challenge small imbalances preserved peace. What I didn't realize is that an unchallenged imbalance grows roots. It becomes policy. It becomes paperwork. It becomes precedent. And once a precedent is signed, it hardens. I didn't file a lawsuit to punish my husband. I filed it because contracts matter, because structures matter. Because fairness shouldn't rely on personality or trust alone, it should be written clearly, protectively, symmetrically. The most powerful part of this story isn't the court filing. It's the moment I stopped negotiating against myself. The moment I understood that protecting your value doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you responsible. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic showdowns, no public takedowns. Just documentation, just clarity, just calm persistence. And sometimes that's far more disruptive than anger. If you've ever been described as easy, low maintenance, or not the type to make a fuss, I want you to remember something. Those labels can be compliments, or they can be cages. The difference depends on whether you choose them or simply accept them. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that your silence was writing someone else's version of you? I'd really like to know.